Well, good evening. I'm Nancy Dunlap, and I'm chairman of the roundtable for the Baker Institute. And for those of you who are our members, you know that we represent sort of the outreach portion of the Baker Institute. The purpose is to take the work that goes on at the university and get beyond the hedges, as President Gillis says, of the university's work. Our support of the Baker Institute provides a good portion of the operating expenses that enable the Institute to develop new programs and provide their underpinnings until they can go out and find support from other organizations. We are pleased tonight to have invited representatives of the economics department and the faculty at the Jones Business School to join us in light of the opportunity to hear a visiting professor to the Jones School. We're very pleased to be having this program and represent coordination with the Jones Business School. And I talked with Gil Whitaker yesterday, and he was disappointed that he was committed to being out of town and couldn't be here. And likewise, Ed Dirigian, the director of the Baker Institute, had planned to be here, and he too has been called out of town. So Rick Stoll and I are holding the fort. And I'm pleased to announce that coming this fall, in fact on October 5th, the Baker Institute will host a reunion of the Secretaries of Treasury, of which I understand there are 10 currently living Secretaries of Treasury, and already 6 of them have agreed to come. This is one in a series of programs that we conduct with the Woodrow Wilson Center. The first 2 were in Washington. In fact, some of our members were able to be in Washington at the last reunion, which was on the topic of the security advisors. So the Secretary of Treasury will meet here in Houston on October 5th, and you'll all be getting an announcement of that. And also, we anticipate that there will be an awarding of the Enron Prize for Distinguished Public Service this fall. We're not at liberty to announce the recipient at this time, but as those of you who've been to the previous Enron ceremonies know, this is usually a wonderful opportunity to hear a particularly notable public servant make a statement of interest to our membership. So there will be certainly other things upcoming. I think the Baker Institute and the Roundtable are going to take a little bit of a summer vacation from the whirlwind of activities that we've been enjoying this spring. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rick Stoll, who is the Associate Director for Academic Affairs here at the Baker Institute, to introduce our distinguished guest. Rick?
Thank you. It's my job to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Weidenbaum, who is a man of many accomplishments, and his presentation tonight is entitled Breaking the Deadlock in U.S. Trade Policy. I want to apologize to him. I'm going to keep my introduction brief, and it doesn't do justice to his career. I always assume you'd rather hear from our speakers than about them. So let me start off by saying, as was noted, he is here right now this semester as a visiting professor at Rice's Jones School. He is one of a handful of people that I'm aware of who has had distinguished careers simultaneously in academia, business, and government. It's kind of a tough thing to do, even one of those, let alone all 3. He holds the Mallinckrodt Distinguished University Professorship at Washington University in St. Louis. He's a highly regarded academic, having published a number of books and articles on economic policy, taxes, government spending, and regulation. For 26 years, he was the director of the Center for the Study of American Business at Washington University at St. Louis. And I think it's important to note that when he retired from that directorship at the end of the year 2000, the center was renamed the Murray Weidenbaum Center on the Economy, Government, and Public Policy. And it's hard to imagine a more fitting tribute to someone who has spent a great deal of his life at a center to have them turn around and name it after him. Now, when he puts on his business hat, he has worked for General Dynamics and for Boeing, serving as their corporate economist, and he also serves on the board of directors of a number of corporations. He is probably most well known to most of us for his career in government service. He has served on the Congressional Joint Tax Committee as an Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy, on the President's Economic Policy Advisory Board, and of course as Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And I'd like to close my brief recapitulation of some of the highlights of his career by giving you a few words about him that were penned by our Institute's honorary chair, Secretary James Baker. Dr. Weidenbaum is that rare scholar who thrives at the intersection where policy and action come together. That and his clear thinking and writing have made him an invaluable leader in government, in business, and in the academy. We all owe him a great debt of gratitude. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Murray Weidenbaum.
Thank you. I can't resist getting even with my old friend Jim Baker. And if you just bear with me for a moment, we all know that Secretary Baker, as he's known in these parts, is an outstanding attorney, diplomat, negotiator. But here at the Baker Institute, I'd like to take a few minutes to give a different view of my former colleague. When you're sitting around in that Oval Office with the president day after day, it's very intimidating. And there's such a tendency, almost universal, to become, frankly, a yes man. Yes, Mr. President. Oh, yes, Mr. President, that's such a great idea. Yes, yes. And don't get me wrong, those of us in that inner circle were very supportive of Ronald Reagan. But before he made his decision, there were a few people who occasionally would argue with the man. To be very blunt, a professor on leave from an endowed chair, no big deal for him to argue with the president. After all, everyone knew sooner or later, I was going to go back to where I came from. But Jim had a lot at stake. You know, future Secretary of the Treasury, emphasized future. Future Secretary of State. And yes, he wouldn't hesitate giving his view, disputing, arguing, so that the President of the United States, before he made a decision, had a variety of viewpoints. You get a better decision-making process. But frankly, it takes a lot of integrity, takes a lot of courage to exercise that role. And that's the role, I think, unless you're in that venue, you don't appreciate, which is why I'm delighted to be here at Jim Baker's Institute. And I thank you for the opportunity. My assigned topic, as you know, is essentially the work that I've been doing at the Jones School since coming here at the beginning of January. It is a continuation of the task that I undertook about a year and now it's close to 2 years ago, when Congress set up a Blue Ribbon Commission to develop some common ground on the subject of international trade policy. Because it was true then, and unfortunately it's still true today, international trade policy in the United States is deadlocked. As you know, when President Clinton asked for fast-track authority, to surprise many people, he was turned down. When the World Trade Organization met in Seattle to develop another round of trade negotiations, the meetings collapsed. And frankly, not because of the crowds milling around in the streets, but because of fundamental disagreement between the developed nations and the developing nations. I don't think at the present time the outlook is very good in the United States for breaking the ice. And the reason I say that is, having spent a year and a half chairing that commission that Congress set up on the trade deficit, going around the country, getting the views of interest groups of individuals around the country, I saw firsthand how far apart we have become. And it wasn't that long ago when free trade was one of the few issues that business, government, and consumers strongly agreed upon. In the 1960s, the AFL-CIO was one of the strongest supporters of the Kennedy round of tariff reductions. In the 1970s, Consumers Union sued the government to stop the effort to erect trade barriers on steel imports because they said that would hurt the consumer. And of course, by and large, always with exceptions, business isn't as monolithic as some people think, but by and large, the business community has been supportive of open trade. Well, that consensus started eroding in the late 70s and 80s as so many factory workers, especially the members of the United Auto Workers, the United Steel Workers, just to cite the two most important unions, suffered an erosion of about 50% of their membership. It wasn't just the old cyclical unemployment, but so many literally hundreds of thousands of factory workers lost their jobs permanently as imports made such substantial erosion in our basic domestic markets. At the same time, something else, a very new development happened, the rise of the environmental movement. Well, at first, the unions and the environmentalists were not exactly cozy friends. The unions looked upon the environmentalists as elitist snobs who didn't understand working people. And that was reciprocated by all sorts of comments about hard hats and brains to match and all sorts of language like that. What brought them together, and it was basically unplanned, was the battle on NAFTA. Now, they lost the battle, and NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, was approved by the Congress. But the unions and the environmentalists saw that they could work together. And it was their joining forces that killed Fast Track in the previous administration, and that is making the prospects for another round of trade negotiation so questionable. When a year and a half ago Congress set up the commission that I chaired to develop, that was our charter, to develop common ground, and we had 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans. We tried our darndest, but frankly we split 6 versus 6 on such basic questions as, is it consistent with free trade to have compulsory labor standards on trade agreements? The answer that 6 Republicans gave was no way, because we saw that as a fundamental obstacle, knowing that the developing countries would not, and they said so clearly and publicly, loudly and repeatedly, no guessing about it, they wouldn't sign a trade agreement in the future that imposed high-cost Western labor standards on these low-cost, low-skilled industrial developing nations. They saw the imposition by the West of environmental and labor standards on their economies as a disguised form of protectionism. But as a result, with the unions and the environmentalists pushing for imposing high-cost labor and environmental standards on trade agreements, with the developing countries vehemently opposed to them, with the business community, in a sense, and government itself caught in the middle. How do we break this deadlock? Frankly, I don't have an easy answer, because after a year and a half, our commission issued as I say, a divided report. What I've been doing since coming here in January is to try to develop a strategy for generating common ground, for bridging the gulf between those of us who have been advocates of open trade, open flows of investment around the world, and those with a very different set of priorities. One thing I will tell you from all the hearings that our commission held around the country, and that is just trying to play good economist, trying to educate the unions and the environmentalists and human rights groups and people like that about the technical error of their ways. That won't sell. You may disagree with their solutions, i.e. erect trade barriers, go protectionist. But ladies and gentlemen, these groups reflect real serious concerns on the part of, I'd say at this point, a majority of our citizens. One of the things that impressed me was the University of Maryland, that did not have an axe to grind, commissioned a detailed survey, public opinion survey, but not a quickie, very detailed, in-depth, large sample survey of the American population in recent months. What is your view on trade policy in the United States? That was very revealing. First of all, as a principle, the majority of the population continues, despite what the interest groups are pushing for, a majority of the people continue to advocate open trade, free trade. But with increasing numbers, there are concerns that the benefits of trade are not widely distributed around the United States. They fear that except for the business community, who they see as getting the bulk of the benefits, they fear that the bulk of the benefits of trade are going to the other nations that ship their products to us in our relatively open markets and are reluctant to accept our products in turn. And yes, they are concerned about environmental and labor standards in developing countries overseas. Well, how do you respond to that? As I say, I think it's more than just saying, look, dummies, you don't understand the economics of the situation. Of course, I love to do that in the classroom, and that's what I get paid to do. But in the public policy arena, that's just not effective. So my approach is, let's try to develop common ground by, one, showing some understanding of the problems that folks are facing and coming up with some solutions that will be constructive. So for starters, I look at the benefits of trade, of international commerce, and seeing how we can increase the benefits. And then, very frankly, look at the people who are hurt by trade, and they are. And many more think they are. And what can you do to help those people? It sounds like a very obvious way of approaching the subject, but I have to admit, that's not the way the profession has looked upon this. The answer is much more peremptory that you get in the lecture hall, and that is, well, if the benefits to the society of trade exceed the costs to the society, it's good and let's do it. Well, the fact is the people who benefit are widely dispersed, don't even realize they're benefiting, but the people who are hurt or think they're hurt, they are truly hurting. So first I've come up with a set of recommendations to increase the benefits. For example, I focus on the fact that our market is far more open than the markets of most of the countries we trade with. And as I like to put it, free trade should be a two-way street. So I think it's not just enough to enter into trade agreements that say, we'll open our markets and you open your markets. We need to police those agreements much more seriously. And what hurts is, when I've looked into the data, the enforcement, the budgets, the staffing of the Department of Commerce, the trade representative responsible for staffing these matters, has been coming down in the last 10, 15, 20 years, while the amount of trade, the number of trade agreements to police, to enforce, has been going up. Well, that's a signal to the rest of the world we don't take this stuff seriously. So I think, one, we need to show that we ourselves take the enforcement of trade agreements seriously, and then two, that we expect, as we open our markets, we expect our friends overseas, and not just our friends in the various nations we trade with, to do the same. I'll give you, just because China's it's something we read about, and I spent a lot of time in China in recent years. They love to, with great fanfare, announce market opening actions, and they'll get rid of permits for certain class of imports. Sounds good. Doesn't make it any easier to export from the U.S. in those categories, because they've eliminated the permits and they've substituted licenses, or in other cases they've substituted the licenses for import. In other words, they'll play the paperwork game. Well, we have to show we are serious. Then, of course, there's a whole category of what I call self-inflicted wounds. There are many barriers that we erected during the Cold War to control exports from the United States. In large measure, when you examine carefully the rationale for these restraints on our own exports, it's in terms of shielding our technology from the Soviet Union. Well, Cold War's over, and we haven't updated our own approach. We also like to think of ourselves as an island of free trade in the world of protectionism. There's no shortage of U.S. barriers to imports into the U.S., and many of those are counterproductive. I'll give you a simple example. If you've ever taken a cruise to Alaska, the chances are you didn't start in Seattle, which is a natural U.S. port to go to Alaska, but you flew or drove or were bused to Vancouver, Canada, and got the ship there. Why bypass our own port? Oh, there's a strange thing called the Jones Act, which isn't keeping up with the Joneses. It's a complicated piece of regulation which has backfired, which has hurt Seattle at the benefit of Vancouver. That wasn't the intent, but that's the way so much of our archaic trade regulation operates. But then there's a whole other category that I think needs to be dealt with in a comprehensive way, and that's the folks who are hurt. My favorite example, because many of those were witnesses before the commission I chaired, the 50-year-old unemployed factory worker who was told, well, why don't you go into a training program, by the way, that if you complete it, you'll make half of what you made in your old job, and you'll be competing against kids half your age. That's not very attractive to, and they're not so mythical. They're around the 50-year-old unemployed factory worker. We've got to overhaul those training programs. I've looked into them in detail, and let me say something that shouldn't be too surprising. Those governmental programs are bureaucratic. Very few people use them. And a lot of naive proponents of free trade like to say, well, see, there can't be many people hurt by trade because the programs set up to help them aren't used. The reason they're not used is they don't work. They're a bureaucratic nightmare. They need to be simplified. They need to be updated. They need to be made far more efficient and effective. And let me say, for the young people who are laid off because of imports, I don't think it's a government adjustment program that's necessary. We have found in many cases our junior colleges. Yeah, I'm not saying outstanding universities that produce PhDs like Rice or Washington University is the place for an unemployed industrial worker, but those junior colleges around the country are geared for that. In many cases, they help the folks turn around, develop skills for new jobs. By the way, there's nothing like, however, a healthy economy generating lots of new jobs month in, month out, as has happened in the past decade. That's the best solution. But what we do about the very real concerns about labor and environmental standards. Well, the folks in the free trade camp like to say, well, we have a UN organization called the International Labor Organization. They're supposed to, they're responsible for labor standards around the world. Why should we complicate trade agreements? The fact is, the ILO is a paper tiger. They've set 8 core standards. Radical things like allowing workers to join unions if they want to, trying to curtail child labor, avoiding discrimination in the workplace. Items that are part and parcel of the U.S. Labor Code, only ours are tougher. Well, of the 8 core labor standards, we've only approved 2, which is the most direct way of saying we don't take this stuff seriously. Well, if you don't want labor standards to serve as disguised protectionism when the unions want to put them into the trade agreements, I think there's no alternative than to take organizations like the ILO, International Labor Organization, which are geared to deal with standards, to take them seriously. In the environmental area, it isn't quite so neat because there isn't a comparable agency, but there are ways, and in my research I've identified ways without trying to convert the WTO, which doesn't want to become, and shouldn't become, doesn't know how to become an environmental agency, how to make them a little more environmentally friendly, because they've had a tin ear when it comes to the true concerns of the environment. I'll give you just one example. More damage was done to erode the consensus on trade by the WTO brushing aside the concerns about dolphins, which you may come across, being caught in nets, in fishing nets. They're just brushing that aside in a very bureaucratic way, did more to generate this massive environmental opposition to open trade than anything else. And one final point on this. I think the unions and the environmentalists are right in saying that the WTO needs to be opened up. Not too surprisingly, it has become a bureaucratic organization. So if a closed, I won't say closed shop, the unions wouldn't appreciate that, but yes, It's hard for the kind of thing that our Congress does all the time, give opportunities for interest groups to voice their opinion, to be heard. They need to open up the WTO so that interest group, not to convert it to a debating society, of course not, but to give various interest groups a feeling they have their day in court. And that term is the appropriate one because the trade disputes pretty much operate like courts in terms of the organization dealing with trade disputes. And yet, unlike our court system, there's no opportunity to provide a friend of the court brief, which is standard procedure in U.S. courts. Now, in a sense, what's really needed to try to bridge the gap isn't any specific proposal, any specific legislation, but a greater attempt to appreciate the viewpoint, the concerns of the other fellow. When I see the interaction between the proponents of open trade and those who want to restrict trade, it sounds like two groups shouting at each other. To sum it up, it's, to use a description each uses of the other, it's greedy business monopolists vying with environmental wackos. As long as each group thinks of the other that way, there's no way we're going to develop common ground. And let me leave you with this final point. Time is not necessarily on our side. The longer there's this deadlock in American trade policy, we find the European Union increasingly using this as an opportunity to develop improved trade and investment relationships here in the Western Hemisphere. We may talk about a free trade agreement for the Americas, but the major investor in Brazil now is no longer the United States. It's Western Europe, led by Spain. And that's just for starters. So we might very well find, whether it's a formal alliance and formal trade agreement or not, that while we're deadlocked, so many of the countries in Latin America are establishing closer ties with the European Union. We're muffing a real opportunity, and it's so important that the various groups involved try to develop some understanding of the needs, of the concerns. And yes, the folks who feel they are hurt by trade come away from these issues with the understanding, with the belief, rightly or wrongly, that not only are they bearing the burden, but the other fellows who are getting the benefits don't care about them. And we have a very selfish reason for caring about the other fellow, because those other fellows have the power, and they've been using it, to prevent any future action, future progress on the vital front of international economics. I thank you for the opportunity of joining you, and I'll warn you about the question and answer period. I have a well-earned reputation for entertaining questions. I don't always answer them. Is this vodka or? Yes, ma'am.
But we're going to have microphones so we can get this on tape. Everybody can just wait till wouldn't it be up to the legislators to fix this deadlock and to do something? And why don't the legislators, in Washington, why don't they do something to fix that problem so that that port is used instead of Vancouver? Where do you start? There must be someone else who is this.
Well, I'd
Well,
love
there's my
to.
question.
I'd love to dump. You're getting to the heart of the matter, so I love your question. I'd love to be able to dump on the members of the Congress, and
I'll help you.
and many of them deserve it. But that's why they set up this commission that I was chairing for a year and a half to try to develop a common ground. And we really made a strong effort. We elected one Republican chairman. My vice chairman was a Democrat. We had a nonpartisan staff. I had them take turns chairing the hearings. So it wasn't a one-man show. Each hearing was run by a different member of the commission, and half the hearings were, not coincidentally, half of the hearings were run by Democrats, the other half by Republicans. There's no meeting of the minds. And I had senators and congressmen testify before my commission, which I told people like Senator Byrd I appreciate the role reversal. Usually people like me testify and they're up chairing it. This was the other way around. But at best or at worst, we are a representative form of government. And our Congress represents the people, and there's no basic agreement. Free trade, in my time, there aren't that many advantages to the aging process, but there are a few of them. Free trade used to be the signature issue of the League of Women Voters. The consumer organizations now, by and large, are in the other camp. As long as the unions and the consumer groups and the environmental groups and human rights groups are in the other camp, it's hard, not all of them, but large proportions. It's hard for the typical senator or Congress representative to support true free trade. They'll only come around and break that legislative deadlock when the citizens, when the results in that poll I cite get turned around. This is why, very frankly, as an educator, I welcome the opportunity to educate.
Well, then you must be the key.
I'm the culprit.
To make this happen. So I hope you go around and talk with everybody.
Well, I've talked here in Houston. I've talked to the Committee on Council on Foreign Relations, the Committee on Foreign Relations. I thought I got some enthusiasm there. I've given with a bit more detail, technical detail, several presentations in Washington D.C. I'm doing a bit of writing, so I can hit many different audiences, but it's not a one-man show. We have to have sustained effort by the citizenry because this, I say, this situation didn't just happen. In the 60s and the 70s, there was a solid phalanx for free trade, and in the 80s and 90s, it broke apart. It took a long time to break apart. It's not going to be overnight that we can put it together again. Yes, sir.
I found your comment about the people that are benefiting very dispersed and the people that are either being hurt or think they're being hurt very collected and well organized. I thought that was very insightful. And then you gave one benefit that you could think of, which had to do with the retraining programs, although you said they needed to be better. Are there any other benefits you've been able to come up with to transform the people that think they're being hurt into not being hurt?
If we can open, after all, and here's where I quarrel with the political economy, not the economic analysis of my fellow economists. The mainstream economic profession will say, well, you're wasting your time talking about trade barriers overseas because they don't affect the trade deficit. They just affect the composition of the trade deficit. The fact is, they convey having tremendous, and they do exist, very large barriers to U.S. exports. That tells the American public that the system, the trading system is unfair. And I think that's at the heart of a lot of the opposition to fast track and to trade agreements. So we really have to open up more trading opportunities that also will create more export jobs to replace the jobs that have been eliminated by imports. Yes, sir.
There's one issue that you didn't address, which I have often wondered about, and maybe you didn't address it because it's not very important, but there's been this tendency to use trade sanctions in place of military action in lots of situations. And I guess I've often wondered to what extent that tendency legitimized this tendency to use trade policy for other things, environmental and so on, standards that really started with the idea of using trade as a strategic weapon.
That's part of the problem, is also part of the solution. Don Rumsfeld, the old and new Secretary of Defense, was on our commission. In my debate with him on this subject, I told him at one point, if I close my eyes, it sounds like I'm back in the Reagan White House debating Cap Weinberger, because the position hasn't changed. What's attractive about sanctions, if you're a national security person, is it's off budget. It doesn't cost the Pentagon a nickel. And they're making a statement. It doesn't cost the State Department a nickel either, for that matter. But you're making a statement. But what is the statement? The statement tends to be a very ineffective statement. Unilateral sanctions don't work. There's no experience where the effect is anything other than diverting trade from American companies and American workers, American farmers, to foreign companies, workers, and farmers. That's the main effect. But to be blunt, it's not going to be any easier to convince Don Rumsfeld than it was to convince Cap Weinberger. It took George Shultz in there, by the way, to convince, not Cap, but to convince our mutual boss, Ronald Reagan. It's a hard sell, because you're comparing national security with economic prosperity, and national security tends to be equated with patriotism. But my point is a very practical one. If it isn't effective, it doesn't help the national security. It's a one-way street. It only hurts the economy. And yes, it creates a bad precedent. It said you can use trade for other reasons, for other purposes. You need the president. You need to call the shots. But still, maybe there is a role for education, because every study I've ever come across or participate in says that unilateral sanctions are ineffective. So if it's not worth doing, then you have to wonder, well, what about sticking on labor standards and environmental standards? Will they be any more effective? Let me say, I think not. As I said earlier, I spend a lot of time in China these days. So I serve on a panel that responds to the big concerns on campuses that American companies manufacturing in China using child labor, sweatshops, and all that. Turns out that's typically not the case. That's mythology for a very simple reason. There's no shortage of workers over 18 who want those jobs. And yet, just like the sanction issue, people think, well, we've got to set higher standards for those folks there. But the fact is, those may not be very good jobs by our standards, but for the folks in a place like China, not only are they attractive jobs, but when an American company like Mattel, which I've checked out, whose factories I checked out, if they'll announce on a Friday that they want 100 new workers Monday, they'll get at least 1,000. And the attitude of the spokesmen, representatives of those countries is, don't do us any favors. Don't protect us from the foreign investment, especially the American investment, which happens to be top of the line. There's such one of the points in my written paper I talk about. One of the myths is that American companies are running away from the U.S. American industry is investing overseas. Well, the net flow since the 1960s has been into the United States. More foreign companies are building plants, factories, creating jobs in the U.S. than American companies are going overseas, and 2/3 of the American money going overseas into factories goes into Japan, Canada, and Western Europe, that have labor and environmental standards at least as high as ours. Why do they go there? Obviously not to escape costs, but that's where the market is. That's where people who can afford to buy our sophisticated products. Yes, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of education that needs to be generated for the folks who are on the fence, but we still have to deal with the folks who are really hurting. I'll try to give a short answer to a longer question. Yes, ma'am.
As you know from some of our personal conversations,
Hi, Karen.
Hi. I very much agree with you that the part of the solution to the deadlock lies in having effective worker retraining programs, and also that we clearly in future trade agreements are going to need to make some meaningful concession to environmental issues. But I wonder what your thoughts are on the following two things, one of which I think is probably necessary even if those other two things fall into place, and one of which I wonder might not be a continued impediment. First, it seems to me that as long as labor and environmental organizations keep advertising very publicly and very visibly the so-called costs of free trade and globalization, that business absolutely has to respond as the organized and main beneficiary of trade's benefits. And in the absence of business groups launching some sort of counter-campaign, I wonder whether we have any chance of breaking the impasse. And I wonder if business is capable of doing that until it feels it's really in a crisis. So, of course, the healthcare industry was able to respond to the recent discussion in the last campaign about prescription drugs under Medicare with a very effective campaign. Of course, we know how the healthcare industry also responded to the Clinton administration's healthcare proposal. And I wonder if something like that isn't necessary. And then secondly, I notice among my business school students, most of whom are in their late 20s, that being anti-global has almost replaced the Woodstock generation and the anti-Vietnam War sentiment. I have a lot of students who, for instance, wanted to go up to Quebec, couldn't, of course, do their class schedules, but wanted to go up to Quebec because that was where the scene was. And so I really wonder, even if we take care of all the other problems, whether being anti-globalization hasn't become sort of a new cause of sorts.
Oh, sure. It's a lot more fun than doing something very serious. And although I doubt if business is the most effective place to respond, remember that the detailed University of Maryland poll showed that it's business that gets the benefits. The rest of us don't, apparently, from trade. It's not true, but that's the perception. Well, first of all, if there's anything I've learned in my endless earlier campaign to reduce the burden of onerous government regulation on the society, it's the awesome power of ridicule. And actually, that's how Ronald Reagan and I first got together. He used all my examples of dumb regulation in his radio broadcasts and columns. My favorite photograph, I've lost it in transit, of the Seattle whatever, was this lone person carrying a placard that said, "Food is for people, not for export." That's so nuts. That is divorced from reality. But you have to understand, see, business is bad. And the reason exports are bad is, see, exports benefit business. The fact that millions of people around the world would starve if America didn't export food to them, that doesn't matter. The fact is exports benefit business, therefore exports are bad. Thousands of farms would go broke if it weren't for exports. We need the equivalent of the League of Women Voters. We need the equivalent of the Consumers Union when those mainstream consumer groups favored open trade, because one, businesses perceived as too obviously self-serving, and you know, business isn't monolithic. I held hearings in Pittsburgh. You couldn't tell the difference. The old phrase, "There's not a dime's worth of difference between the steel companies and the steel workers union on the issue of trade." They want fair trade, and it's only fair that you keep out imports. In Washington, this is known as the hook. So
It's a small hook. How about one more question? We are going to have a reception afterwards, and perhaps we can continue this. But how about one more question here?
yes, sir.
What about, is there anything left of the balance of trade? We always hear or read about the deficit of the United States. Does it matter?
Yes and no.
Well, that's a good answer.
No, it doesn't matter because all through the past decade, the trade deficit was going this way, and employment in the United States was going this way, and the level of economic activity was going this way. The trade deficit is finally slowing down, if not turning down. So is the economy slowing down or turning down. So from that point of view, it's a symptom. We import more when the economy is healthy. We export less when the economies of other countries aren't as healthy. But so that's the no. No, it doesn't matter. But then there's another side to it, and that is financing the $200-odd billion of trade deficit. That's not easy. So far, we've lucked out. Foreigners send to the U.S. The equivalent of the $230 billion or whatever trade deficit we've been running. And we've been financing the trade deficit because foreigners find the U.S. a very attractive place to invest. Should they change their mind at a time where interest rates are coming down in this country, the Fed would have a dilemma. how do we finance the trade deficit? Do they have to, how do we attract new foreign investment? Do we have to raise interest rates at a time the economy has to come out of recession or slow down or whatever unpleasantness we're experiencing? So that's the part that's much more worrisome, but so far so good. So far there hasn't been a shortage of foreign investment, but there's a fundamental problem. Why do we need all that foreign investment in the first place? Because Americans save so little, so that we can't finance our domestic investment with domestic saving. That's why we need a fundamental tax reform in this country to encourage more saving, so we don't need as much foreign capital in the first place. It's a very hard sell, and it's a different speech. But thank you for the opportunity.